I'm Gwen Beebe. I'm the data analyst for performance and refinement with CHIP, and I'm going to share our equity dashboard with you. We're really excited about this. It's going to be a great tool for our community to start drilling down on inequities in our community and try to figure out what's going on with those and how we can fix them. There's a lot going on with this dashboard, but it's made to be as easy to use as possible. So we're going to break it down into pieces and we're just going to step through it together and then look at some ways that we can use this to learn more information about our system. The equity dashboard is always going to show information for the last 12 months. It's updated at the beginning of each month, so you're always looking at the most recent information available to us. On the left-hand side, we've got some options for selecting the people that are going to be included in our charts. At the bottom, we get to choose which programs we'd like to include. And then all of these charts, this is really the heart of it. This is telling us where the disparities are in our system. Anywhere you see blue, those are the people that you've selected here as your equity group. And the gray is everybody who is not in that group. An important thing to know here is that we're not going to assume membership in a group. So for instance, right now we're looking at all people of color. So everything that's blue, that represents folks accessing services in our community that identified as BIPOC. And gray represents folks that identified as white. If we didn't get information on somebody's race or ethnicity, they're just not going to be included here because we're not going to assume one way or the other. So let's talk first about our equity groups. Each one of these, we can look at BIPOC folks, Black folks, Latinx, LGBTQ+, young adults, just 18 to 24, folks that have ever presented to a program and self-identified that they struggle with mental health, folks that have reported that they have a disabling condition, a physical disabling condition, and veterans. So we can click on any of these to filter all of our charts to look at that group specifically. We can also choose which people we'd like to include. We can look at just heads of household. We can look at all adults, we can look at all people. The difference here between all people means that now we're going to be including children in our groups. It's important to be able to look at all of these because while folks that present for services together in a household often share a lot of characteristics, they're not all identical, right? So you could have a household maybe that's headed by a Black woman, but her partner is white or vice versa. And so if you just look at heads of household, you're going to miss some of that additional data. So it's important to be able to look between all of these. One thing to note, if there's an area where families tend to have better outcomes, you'll see that reflected because when you click on all people, you're going to see those outcomes improve. These are our 6 programs that we can choose between. These are just kind of a cross-section of our whole system. When they're all colored in like they are right now, that means we're looking system-wide, anybody that presented across any of these programs. And this includes all the way from first point of contact, street outreach, we're finding someone sleeping outside, sleeping in their car, all the way through to coordinated entry when they're getting assessed for housing, if they're accessing emergency shelter to try to get off the streets. Some folks are able to go into transitional housing, rapid rehousing, which is short-term rental assistance, all the way up to the highest level of support, which is permanent supportive housing. To see what is included in each one of these program types, you can just hover over it and you'll be able to see which programs are included. Let's go ahead and take a look at our 6 charts now. We're going to start in the top left corner with percent of people entering program. The important thing to know about these charts is that if they are feeling intimidating, if you're not sure exactly what you're looking at, you can just go ahead and hover over any one of these charts and it's just going to give you a sentence that tells you exactly what you're looking at. So if you're not much of a math person, not much of a data person, that's fine. This dashboard is made for you too. So here we have percent of people entering program, and right now we're looking at heads of household that self-identified as Black or did not self-identify as Black. So we see 54% of folks entering all programs over the last 12 months self-identified as Black. And if we look at this sentence, it just tells us exactly that. I'm hovering over the blue right now, and if you remember, the blue indicates the group that is within our equity group that we've selected here. So I'm hovering over the blue and it says 3,159 heads of household who entered programs in the last year self-identified as Black, accounting for 54% of included entries. So it's really easy to compare between these two groups. Just hover over it, you'll get that sentence that walks you through it. We're going to go ahead and look at most recent assessment score next. We're on the top right. The assessment score, this is referring to the assessment that's done at coordinated entry. So this is when folks present, they come to access a assessment point, they're working with an assessor. The resources in the homelessness crisis response system are really limited, so it's important to prioritize them to the folks that are going to need the most. So we use an assessment tool to identify the folks that are most vulnerable. The assessment tool that we use here at Indy for now has some documented issues with equity where white folks tend to score higher. This is something we're already working on. We're establishing a work group to try to find a more equitable solution for us. But in the meantime, it's important to know that we do, in fact, see when we look at the most recent assessment score that folks that self-identified as Black are scoring 1.3 points lower. So this indicates that, actually, let's go back to people of color. So white folks are scoring just over a point higher on this assessment tool. Remember, there's a lot of variation here, so this doesn't mean every single white person is outscoring every single BIPOC person, but it's important to understand the overall trend as we try to move towards a more equitable tool. Residents prior to program entry, going back to the idea that we need to prioritize our resources for the folks that need it most, it's important to understand where people entering our system are coming from. Ideally, everybody that's accessing services should be experiencing literal homelessness of some kind. Obviously nobody should be experiencing homelessness, but as long as they are, we need to target them with our services. That includes folks that are fleeing domestic violence, which is this little slice over here. People that are coming from a place not meant for habitation, so a car outside, people that are coming from shelter, from safe haven. So this whole dark bar on the left-hand side, these are folks that are entering from homelessness. And again, we're looking at all of our programs right now. This white section in the middle, this is unknown situations. When they entered program, we don't know where they were coming from. It wasn't reported. This is a fairly large number and definitely a gap that we need to work on narrowing to better understand our system. And then this light section over here, this is not homeless. Wherever they were before did not mean that they were experiencing homelessness. This 5% here, this is BIPOC folks that are heads of household and entered programs in last year. 5% of them were coming from an institutional situation. That can be a medical facility, it could be incarceration, it could be a treatment facility, anything like that. And then this far right one, this is from the housed situation. Either they said they had a rental, they were staying with family and friends, they've been couching. So this just helps you understand where folks are accessing the system from. This is just an overall count of how many people were active in program in a given month. So we can see consistently, we're seeing more BIPOC folks in our programs than white folks. Let's hover over this dot right here. It says in October 2020, there were 1,736 heads of household who self-identified as white active in programs. So again, this is just one of those things where you can just hover over it, get a sentence, tells you exactly what you're looking at. Go on down here onto percents of exits to housing. This is really what it's all about, right? Like the whole point of the system is to help folks move from homelessness into housing that is safe and secure and stable for them. One thing to note here, when you see a spike in the most recent month like this, we run this information early each month, not super early, about 5 to 6 days in to give folks time to get their information in. But one thing that we do note as a system is that positive exits are entered more quickly because they're exciting, right? You housed somebody, you want to record that. So we do tend to see a skewing towards those positive exits early in the month, and then it'll slide back to closer to average as time moves on. So if you start seeing a spike here, don't get too excited until it's lasted at least 2 months. And then we have percent of returns to homelessness. So this is looking at, this one's a little bit trickier. I'm going to go ahead and hover over this. So what this is looking at is for these groups that we've selected. So right now we have all people of color. So on the left, we've got our BIPOC folks, and on the right, we've got our white folks. Everybody that exited any of these selected program types to housing. So through this program, they moved into housing 2 years ago. How many of them ended up returning to the system? So what we're seeing here is that remember, this is just looking at folks that were housed. These were folks that were stable. And how often did that turn out not to be a long-term solution? How many of them had to come back? So we see 35% of our BIPOC folks that were housed 2 years ago have returned to the system, compared to only 30% of our white folks. So that's a real opportunity for our system to make sure that we're helping everybody move into housing that is stable for them. So now let's take a look at how we can use this dashboard to start to narrow in on maybe some more actionable insights now that we understand what we're looking at. So we already know that our returns, we've got a gap here, and we're looking at all of our program types right now, but let's go ahead and narrow in on just our housing programs. So that's going to be transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. I'm going to click on one. We're going to see all of our charts adjust. See, now this is just showing those results for transitional housing. And then if I hold control, I can also click on more than one program type. So I'm holding control, and we're going to go ahead and include rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing in our charts as well. So you can see now they are all colored in. It's easy to see at a glance what is and is not included. So what we're seeing here is that we are routinely serving more BIPOC folks these programs, which makes sense. That reflects our system. But also, of the folks that we house, substantially fewer white folks are returning to homelessness. We're at a 30% return rate for white folks and a 41% return rate for BIPOC folks. So that means it's time to take a hard look at these exit destinations. Are they really as stable as we think they are? Is there anything we can do to help these folks stay housed once we've gotten them into that housing? We already looked at assessment scores for our Black folks. Let's look at veterans briefly. There are a lot more resources available to veterans, obviously. And looking at this, you can see that likely due to those additional resources. Remember our blue line, that's going to be our equity group. We're seeing much higher or much more positive outcomes for our veterans than for the general population. In the last year, there has not been a single month where the percentage of non-veterans exiting programs to housing was higher than the percentage of veterans exiting. So what we can tell from, or one possible takeaway from this, is that having those additional resources really does make a difference. Let's go ahead and go back to our BIPOC group. We've looked a little bit at these equity groups, so now we're going to go ahead and look at the differences that we can see between heads of household, all adults, and all people. Forgive me, this is taking a moment to load. One moment, we're going to go ahead and refresh the page. Can we pause the recording? Or is it just kind of...
Let me see.
Sorry.
It just says stop recording.
I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for a moment, and we'll just switch over to desktop. So I appreciate your patience to bear with me for a moment. All right, we're just going to open it in a different window, and we're going to get right back to it. What we're going to be looking at is the difference between return rates for our BIPOC folks, the difference in return rates between heads of household and adults compared to families, or compared to all people rather. And what that's going to help us narrow in on is whether there are outcome differences between everyone we serve and just families. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. All right, so we've got our BIPOC group selected. We're going to go ahead, since this is my local version, we're going to come down here. We're going to check our date range. It's always going to tell you right here what the date range you're looking at is. So we're just verifying that the date range we're seeing here is in fact the same one I was just sharing. So we're looking at March 1st, 2020, all the way through February 28th, 2021. So let's go ahead and look at our returns. So right now we're looking at just heads of household. So this is using one representative per household. And we're seeing that that return rate is significantly higher for BIPOC folks than for white folks. And we'll go ahead and switch over to all adults, and we'll see whether we see a significant change here. 35% to 29%, we're still seeing a pretty large disparity, relatively speaking. Now we're going to switch to all people, and so this is going to be including children, which is going to weight our data a little differently. And when we go ahead and click on all people, when we include those children, you're seeing that that returns rate differential almost vanishes. So because when we were looking at heads of household and adults, it was substantially higher, what that tells us is that families are less likely to return. And it's significant enough that when you include those children, it actually brings those return rates nearly even for the whole population. So that means that as we're trying to figure out how to fix this differential in our return rates, we really want to focus on the outcomes of our adult households, figure out what's going on there and how we can make those folks more stable. All right, I think we've got time for one more equity group. Actually, we'll look at two more. We're going to look at folks that have reported a physical disability in the past. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to switch back to just the heads of household for now. And so what we're seeing is that overall, for our whole system, we've got all our programs highlighted right now. We're seeing that about 23% of the folks that we've served in the last year reported that they have a physical disability. When we look at street outreach, we're seeing that go all the way up to 38%. These are the folks that are most vulnerable, most likely to be found by street outreach. Coordinated entry also primarily serves folks that are experiencing literal homelessness. Let's go ahead and click on coordinated entry as well. And we're seeing that still staying really high, 38, 37%. And if we look at emergency shelter, let's go ahead and emergency shelter. We see it goes all the way down to 18%. So that's a pretty significant drop. So one thing that could be interesting to look at there is there something that's happening that's stopping these folks that we know are experiencing homelessness from accessing these shelters in an equitable way? So this might be a question of access. Can these folks get into these shelters? Are they well equipped for these folks? So that's a possible point of investigation from here. Another interesting thing, let's go ahead and switch. We're still on emergency shelter, but we're going to go ahead and switch our equity group to Black folks. And we see of all people entering emergency shelter over the last year, or of all the heads of household rather, 55% of them self-identified as Black. And we're going to see in coordinated entry, we're going to see that this is also really high. What we're looking at right now, these are programs that serve folks that are experiencing literal homelessness. So emergency shelter, coordinated entry, we're looking at mid 50%. And if we go ahead and look at street outreach, we're going to note that this drops way off, all the way down to 37%. So this is really interesting because folks that are experiencing homelessness, you'd expect them to interact with coordinated entry, you'd expect them to interact with emergency shelter. So the question here is, are these folks just, are we not finding them? Are we looking in the wrong places? Maybe does it have something to do with how different groups experience homelessness differently? So this is another interesting thing to look at. Where are these folks that are going into coordinated entry and emergency shelter? And why are we maybe not spotting them in street outreach? Or converse, where are all the white folks that we're finding with street outreach that are not accessing coordinated entry? So really digging into the heart of that disparity could be another interesting way to use this. This is just a tool. It's a great tool. We're really glad to have it. There's a lot of good information here, but just having a dashboard, having the information doesn't cause change. We have to look at this, and then we have to go make those changes ourselves and then come back and see if it worked. I hope that this is a helpful tool for you. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. My email is gbeebe@chipindy.org. Rachel, were there any other questions you wanted me to address here at the end, or are we good to let these good folks go?
I wanted to just reiterate a couple of things that were mentioned on the original call. So in case it's not clear, this isn't the original call that Gwen did with about 25 folks just last week. Unfortunately, the recording was not correctly done. So we had to re-record, and we apologize for that. But I did capture a couple of the key questions that people asked in that session. Gwen actually addressed a number of them in this presentation second time around ahead of time. So I wanted to just add that there were a number of questions about how the continuum of care is using this information. As Gwen said, this is a tool, and without action, this is just essentially a mirror to our system. It doesn't do anything on its own, and it's up to us to take action on the information that is being presented to us through this tool. The Blueprint Council has a racial equity work group that's utilizing the National Alliance to End Homelessness racial equity framework to examine racial equity in our system. This dashboard is a part of this process for us as a community, and it's a great step because it allows us to examine these important indicators in our community with an equity lens. The Blueprint Council is going to continue to examine this dashboard, identify system issues, some of which Gwen even mentioned on this call already, that need to be addressed in order for us to improve equity. I also wanted to mention, as Gwen also indicated, our coordinated entry system project manager, Lisa Huffman, is working with folks in the coordinated entry system to identify a more equitable housing needs assessment. We are examining our housing needs assessment and looking for a more equitable tool. As Gwen mentioned, we see disparity here in the way that our tool is used, and this tool has been noted nationally to have disparities. So we're looking for an opportunity to correct that as well. Finally, in addition to connecting with Gwen, if you have questions about the dashboard itself, please reach out to me. If you would like to get more involved with the Continuum of Care's examination of racial equity, I can help you identify which groups are most relevant to you. There's a lot of folks that are talking about equity, but I'm sure you'd like to connect with the one that's most relevant to the work that you'd like to be involved with. If you'd like to connect with me, my name is Rachel Sample, and that email is rsample, S-A-M-P-L-E, @chipindy.org, and I can help connect you to the right place to get involved. I think that's all we got, and appreciate your time for joining us. Thank you, Gwen.
Thanks, Rachel.